Welcome to the Zero Trust Overview section of the Cyber Reference Architectures. My name is Mark Simos, lead cybersecurity architect at Microsoft. Dan?
Thanks, Mark. My name is Dan Menicucci. I'm a chief security advisor working on our corporate security compliance and identity team focused on financial services customers.
Cool. And this Zero Trust Overview is a general overview of the concept. There's a very specific reference architecture for user access in Zero Trust, which we will reference and allude to as we go through this. And there's also a separate module on the open group perspective, which is where the Jericho Forum was hosted for a number of years. So this is just a general overview for it, and so keep an eye out for those other ones as well. So when we take a look at Zero Trust, Zero Trust really does harken back to kind of those early days of the Jericho Forum that started to notice that there were some challenges with how the network perimeter was working. And so we're gonna take a quick look at that and see how this actually played out. So ultimately, when you look at the information technology estate of any reasonable size organization, it's fairly large, fairly complex, lots of applications, lots of devices, lots of servers, and there's quite a bit to it. And when we started to deal with the security problems and we started to have people attacking, oftentimes from the internet and from outside the network, it was really challenging, like how do we solve this problem? So the first version of let's solve the security problem was let's go ahead and put a border around it, borrow from a military doctrine of a security perimeter. And let's say inside is safe and outside is hostile, right? And all that internet stuff that we don't control, that's where the bad guys are coming from. And then we'll keep the stuff inside safe. And this seemed like a pretty simple approach. And to a degree, it worked in the early days. But the challenges started to, and the limitations of this model started to appear, the cracks started to appear over time. And again, like I mentioned, the Jericho Forum kind of picked up on this early in the early 2000s and building up to it in the late 90s, with email attachments going in and out of it, with, as a data leak potential, et cetera. And so what we started to see was those two different things. One is that the assets started appearing, or being sent out of the corporate network and the corporate environment. And so instead of everything that we need to protect and secure being, on our network IP addresses and ranges, we had all these assets, which grew and grew to be cloud services, mobile devices, and so many more business processes, partner interactions, et cetera. And then the other thing that started happening with that step 4 there is the attackers started getting better and better and better at getting into the environment, especially as they built up profit models that kind of incented and encouraged them to do so, and it became less of a hobby and more of a profession for attackers. And so, with phishing and credential theft, attackers are able to fairly easily get inside of a corporate network boundary. Does that mean they get in with every single attack attempt? No. But if they try, 10, 20, 30 times, and fairly cheap and expensive phishing emails, they're probably going to get in at least once in there, and then that gives them a foothold, and then they can go past that boundary. And so what we've really found is that this original assumption doesn't really work. Dan, anything to add there?
No, I think that was a great point. The phishing example that you used, we came from a world where the network perimeter is what we use to protect an organization, but we were reliant upon email and emails from other organizations, which meant that we had to permit, email coming into our corporate network from untrusted sources. And those untrusted sources could be malicious, and in some cases they were, and they contained, malware or phishing URLs, and that became the way for an attacker to get, on the inside of that network perimeter. And it was a place where we were traditionally not as strong because we were over reliant on the hopes that, nobody could get past that strong perimeter that we had built.
Cool. So, and that's really the situation that led us to Zero Trust. And Zero Trust, the way that we define it at Microsoft is actually multi-layered. We sometimes see some confusion where folks aren't quite sure how to define it, or they've heard different definitions of it. And the big reason for this is Zero Trust itself much like digital transformation is changing how businesses do business top to bottom, from how an executive thinks about markets and uses technology to enter those markets, all the way down to business operations people that are doing it, but they're doing it in a different way than a senior director would. And the same thing with cloud transformation, which is changing the way that you buy hardware or purchase IT services, up and down the organization, and of course operate it. Zero Trust is that similar sort of top to bottom transformation. And so that transformation leads to several different changes. The first is at the strategic layer for IT and security. And so Zero Trust kind of anchors there at that top level strategy. Because when you think about that perimeter tactic that we mentioned in the previous slide, it really was a tactic. It was a very specific tactic. You wouldn't, where it came from was military doctrine. You wouldn't necessarily go to war completely with a single tactic. You'd have an overall strategy and have multiple tactics that you use depending on the situation, if you were defending or attacking, et cetera. And so when we tried to make that one tactic an entire strategy, it really started to fall short. And so what Zero Trust really does is forces the creation of a formal strategy that is focused on very specifically business assets. What's important to the business? What are we protecting? We've got to make sure that we're protecting the important things and not a bunch of things that don't matter. And then the other piece is a very specific condition on that, which is we need to protect it wherever it goes. We no longer have that assumption that if it's on the network, we protect it. If it's not, good luck, right? Like that doesn't work. So you've got to protect those business assets wherever they happen to go. And the great thing is this actually makes security so much better, and it's freeing, because by leaving that paradigm behind and all the pain and the constraints of it, we can actually now do new and exciting and interesting things to protect things closer to the asset, to where they matter. We can do things that don't break the user experience. So there's a lot of opportunity in Zero Trust. I view it as an amazing opening up of security to be what it truly should be. And so that strategy has to be applied to the real technical environment, right? And when the perimeter, the utility of the perimeter started to just not work, when the usefulness of it started blowing apart, the first thing that we need to figure out is, how do we provide access to these assets? Because the access requests and using those assets is happening all the time. And so how do we make sure that when we're accessing the cloud and the data on it, that we're actually providing that in a secure way? How do we make sure that the devices that they're using are actually secure and not compromised by an adversary with malware already? So the user access is absolutely the first thing that you hear about, which is why you hear a lot about going from a network to an identity perimeter, or a perimeterless or a borderless type of approach, because the very first step in Zero Trust is reestablishing good access control when you can't count on the firewall to do it for you. Dan, anything to add?
No, and I think, as the productivity environments at most organizations sort of shift to a software as a service world, and when you think about a properly developed cloud service, it's globally available, globally accessible. And what that means is that service provider has put that application to have multiple points of presence across the internet with content delivery networks. And if you're thinking about security still in this network-centric world, where you need to take the user's traffic from wherever they are back to a remote corporate location and to that cloud service, you're suddenly breaking the benefits that service is providing for you, and you're decreasing the overall experience. And by bringing security to the device and to the services that you're trying to protect instead, and getting out of the way of the network traffic, you're giving the user a better and more responsive experience.
Absolutely. And just one note there, some folks may have heard of SASE, or I just forgot the acronym. Secure Access Service Edge. Yep. So folks might have heard that term. That also addresses this space and is really focused on how do you provide that high performance, high responsiveness piece. And so whether you look at it through the frame of Zero Trust or the frame of SASE, many of the same capabilities that you need to provide are absolutely right there in that user access environment. So it's not that there's a SASE approach or a Zero Trust approach. They're actually very compatible with each other. And they focus a little bit more, in the SASE world on performance and network explicitly, whereas Zero Trust is focused on a holistic view of security, which we're going to expand out in a moment. But don't be surprised if you hear that term SASE, S-A-S-E. because it's very, very similar approach to that user access space. Now, where Zero Trust is a little bit different from SASE and is becoming part of that holistic security strategy is you have to apply those principles, which we'll talk about in just a moment here. You got to apply those principles to other parts of the environment, other functions of security. The first of which is security operations. So, the first priority, of course, is user access. You got to provide access control to those new assets. But you might have attackers attack them. You might have incidents there. You might have data disclosure. You might have all sorts of things happening to these assets where they go. You need to have monitoring on that. You need to have a rapid response and rapid recovery so that if the adversary does get access, you need to detect it quickly and you need to remove that access as fast as you can before they can execute a ransomware extortion payload or some other thing. And so modernizing security operations so that you can monitor, detect, and respond inside or outside of the traditional firewall, on the cloud, wherever things are, is the next typical top priority for security for Zero Trust. And then last is OT in the data center. And it seems, especially because we started in this modern, new, OAuth and OIDC, SAML kind of modern access in the cloud, we're talking about OT and data center. How do you apply Zero Trust to, these ancient machines that are, 30 to 50-year-old electronics and 50 to 100-year-old physical machines? The reality is Zero Trust, because it's principle driven, applies to all these environments. And you want to think through them in that principal way to how do you apply that to there. And for the most part, if you've got OT, you want to protect it and you want to have monitoring and inventory and preventive controls in it. And from the OT perspective, but the data center perspective, the way we think about this, because the data center is so complex and has so many applications, that you really want to try and integrate security in when you're actually touching the applications from a development or a migration to the cloud perspective. And you want to tie in bringing Zero Trust principles and security controls as you're doing that. So a lot of people are migrating their workloads to the cloud, doing a lift and shift. Great, let's go ahead and start the segmentation and those kind of controls for the data center as you move to the cloud. You're developing new apps, awesome. Let's go ahead and think through this and make sure security is embedded in it. So as you're working through it and you're familiar with the app and someone's working on it, that's when you bring the security in a native way. And so Zero Trust really applies across all of these things in that holistic way. Anything to add, Dan, before we kind of move on to principles?
No, I really like the, the points about rapid remediation that you mentioned. The reality is, as much as we do to protect an organization, we're going to have times when a security control fails, right? We're going to lose an endpoint to a piece of malware. We're going to lose an end user's credentials to a phishing attack. But what we want to do is make sure that one thing or one control that failed doesn't turn into that broader security event within an organization. And the best way for us to do that is to respond rapidly and remediate so when that initial control fails, so that doesn't become a much bigger problem.
Absolutely. And wherever it starts, if it starts in a third-party SaaS service, or if it starts on an endpoint, or it starts by a user using the same password on a compromised website as they do in their corporate email, doesn't matter where it starts. We want to stop it as fast as we can.
Absolutely.
So do you want to lead us to the principles, Dan?
Yeah, sure. And so when we talk about Zero Trust, and we talk about it broadly, as Mark was sort of shining light on the different scenarios around productivity and how you should think about modernizing your approach to security operations and others, we really want to apply different principles to that approach. And the first one that we've talked about most oftenly is this idea of explicit verification. We've come from a world where authentication and authorization was really pretty simple of, did the user provide their credentials successfully, and do they have access to the resource? In the past, that was enough. We were pretty confident in most cases that you could only authenticate if you're inside that network perimeter, and it was likely the person that they said they were. But as we think about remote workforces and services on the cloud, And the realization, the reality that there's so many different forms of credential abuse that are the initial pieces of a larger security event at organizations. We really need to do more than just that basic, did you provide your credentials successfully? And that starts to look at how strong was the authentication that the user provided? Was it just a password, or is it multi-factor, or hey, ideally it was some sort of passwordless option? Was there risk associated with that session? Was the user working from a location that they normally do, accessing services that they normally do? What can we tell about the device? All of this can raise the assurance that's going along with that authentication, so that we can feel confident granting that user access to that resource. And if we see that, hey, the authentication was successful, but everything else looks strange, maybe that's the case where we deny it and we block it and we say, hey, yes, you found the password for this user, but because everything else you haven't been able to mimic, we're going to deny the request. And the second principle that we talk about is something.
And before you go on, one of the things that we learned, this was an interesting piece during Nobelium, or what some people call Solurigate, or we used to call Solurigate, is that the verify explicitly principle starts with all those examples that you mentioned, but especially as we get into that and the supply chain attacks that we've seen recently, you have to keep going on verify explicitly. This is why it's great as a general purpose principle, because, okay, we've got all that, we've got our accounts good, are we done? Not exactly, because the adversaries are finding ways in through the supply chain. So now you have to explicitly verify the software that you use through technologies like software bill of materials, SBOM, and whatnot. And so this is one of those durable principles that you keep on applying at depth. As the adversaries find new ways in it, you keep grabbing that. It's a very telemetry-focused principle we found. The more data you have, the easier it is to take a look and peel off, okay, that's an imposter pretending to be a user versus an actual real user, or a legitimate app versus an impersonated app. So you really, this one actually keeps going deeper, is one of the things that we've learned over time.
Yeah, really good point.
So least privilege, sorry, go ahead.
No, it was a worthwhile interruption. So the least privilege access is the next principle that we talked to related to zero trust. And certainly least privilege isn't something brand new, specific to zero trust. It's something that we've talked about for a long time. This idea that we're going to give users just enough privilege to perform the tasks that they need. But really, when we think about it in the zero trust world, we want to take it, we want to get to this idea where we don't have standing access, or administrators don't have standing access. And if they need to perform a sensitive function, an administrative function, that they step up their action. They step up their action, and maybe they need to get approval to do so. And after some period of time passes, they go back to being a normal user, really reducing the attack surface related to that user account. Again, aligned to this idea that, hey, we're not going to step up everybody to the highest level of privilege if the user only needs to perform one particular right. Instead, we want to step them up to just enough privilege so that they can perform that action. And again, it's not something new. It's just we want to think about it in a way beyond how we have in the past. And there's a number of capabilities that we have to help make that easier and make it not such a daunting task as it was in the past. But that becomes really the second principle that we talk about from a zero trust perspective.
Yeah, it's quite a long way from the original. Just take people out of the admins group. That was the original least privilege, but there is much more to it. Time and access and whatnot. Yep.
Yeah, and the last piece is this assume breach principle, and I touched on it a little bit on the last slide, and it's really this idea that, hey, you may have a security control fail. You're going to have a user that's going to click on a phishing link, but don't let that be the end of your security approach. It still comes down to defense in depth to make sure that, hey, user clicked on this link. Make sure that you have the telemetry to tell that, the ability to say, hey, that was a malicious link, and we need to treat that user's credentials as compromised. And we think about that really, and it can be applied in all different scenarios. It could be related to that, identity-based attacks, or what's happening on endpoint. mentality that we need to think about as we, design our data centers and our networks, so that, hey, we have a particular application. Let's segment it in a way that, only the services that need to talk to that application can. And if there was a chance that an adversary ever ended up on that system, let's segment it in a way that it's not going to have access to the rest of the corporate network. Additionally, doing things like applying encryption so that, again, the segments are only going to contain the applications that are necessary for that system to run, but it's not going to expose that attacker to be able to see network traffic from other systems. And if they happen to see it, the encryption would prevent them from being able to make that data useful that they were able to look at.
Yeah, and I like to think about assumed breach as sort of the mother or the father or the godfather, depending on your favorite analogy, of the other principles, because this is the mindset, right? This is the way you think about things, and it's also one of those gifts that keeps on giving, because you can apply it to security operations. Okay, what if the attacker got to here? What if they got to this access? Am I monitoring and protecting against all my other stuff that could access? And so it really does have that kind of depth and breadth as well, where it just keeps on being applied. So we were fairly harsh on the network controls, right, to be honest. And there's a reason for that, because we have to shock ourselves out collectively as an industry from this habit where we just unthinkingly think, oh, it's on the network, it's off the network. And even, the best of us kind of find ourselves kind of falling into that trap sometimes. But the truth is it's not that we're just against network, right? It's about picking the right tool for the job. And it's really important to consider, as we take a look at these different kind of initiatives or environments, where you're going to see more identity versus network controls when you're looking at the access control perspective. So in the user access and productivity space, you're talking cloud apps, you're talking mobile apps, you're talking modern protocols, you're talking where the network simply doesn't reach as an intercept point in most cases. You don't want to be hairpinning all of your Office 365 traffic through on-premises, because it's just going to slow it down. You're not going to get a lot of value out of it. It's a lose-lose proposition. So from that perspective, the user access and productivity is very heavily favoring the identity piece, but it still has to be integrated with the network, and you have to have this integrated approach for access control. You definitely still need some basic hygiene for your network, things in your data center for what they're accessing, the firewalls on the endpoint clients, et cetera. So there's definitely network controls in there, but it is very, very heavy on the identity side. Now, you look at the opposite effect in the operational technology environment. Again, 30 to 50-year-old electronics. 1970s, 1980s, when they were retrofitting some of these things, these older machines with electronics, or putting in new machines, some of these natively support IDP, but a lot of them are custom industry protocols that had to have a bridging device to even talk TCP/IP. And so it's really important to understand that you're not going to get OIDC or OAuth or SAML or any of these modern protocols that you would prefer in identity, because identity has this much richer context of what's happening. You got to use what you've got. And so the OT environment tends to be very, very heavy in the network. And now on the identity, on the border of that, so say you have your OT environment, your SCADA ICS systems on a separate network or a security zone, you still have machines that are going to interact with it. And that's where you really want to make sure you're extremely rigorous about, kind of identity and application access things, like making sure those users are using multi-factor authentication, making sure that the machines are patched, sort of the much more traditional kind of productivity environment controls, but they have to be really rigorous if they're sitting on the border of that OT environment and interacting with it. And so you tend to see this opposite effect. And again, you want a complementary strategy where they're really working together. And then last is the data center. So data center is a little bit more of a healthy mix, because pretty much all of the applications that have been written in the past 20, 30 years assumed they were on a safe network, unless they were specifically web facing, right? And so they assume that they were on the safe network, and they essentially need the security controls, the network security controls, to make sure that they, you've got an inbound firewall, web application firewalls, et cetera, et cetera. So, these things need those traditional network controls and network boundaries in that data center, in that infrastructure environment. But But at the same time, when you start looking at what the cloud is starting to offer, and you can essentially apply an identity to a machine without having to necessarily recode the application. And the new applications can get an identity. And you get a lot better insight when you know which component on the server, which application is talking to to another one, and for what reason. You get a lot of opportunity to bring in that richness of the identity controls and the modern protocols that are much better than simply putting up a port and protocol firewall rule. And so in the data center, you have much more of a mixed story because you've got that large set of legacy applications. You've got these new ones being developed simultaneously. So you have to really work with both network and identity access controls together. Dan, anything any other thoughts to add there?
No, I think that those are, some great points. Going back to what you said earlier, zero trust is a multi-technology strategy, and it's important to realize that you're not going to always, or you're probably never going to lead with just one technology alone. It's always going to be a mixture of things, and it's going to be important to think about all the threats that exist against that asset that you're trying to protect, and use the right technologies to protect it.
Cool. So, and of course, security operations, they get any incident no matter where it happens. So they pretty much have to know both of them. We do one quick note there is people in the security operations tend to have been trained a lot more on network, and they're much more familiar with IP addresses and CIDRs and whatnot. So you're gonna end up, especially as you go to the cloud, you need to do a lot of training of your security operations analysts, make them familiar with the identity protocols, make them understand those authentication flows. That's super critical as you introduce more and more identity controls, that they can actually monitor those, see the anomalies, have detection tools on them, know how to respond to them. So, making sure that SecOps is ready for this whole thing, including the OT space, which is new to many security operations or SOCs. So just kind of keep those elements in mind, as they really do have to cover that whole spectrum. And by the way, they will also be the most vocal advocates for fixing any hygiene issues, because if you didn't patch and they got an incident, they're the one that has to deal with it. So be ready for that and support them, because they're doing really good stuff for the organization. And so this last piece here is the Rapid Modernization Plan, or RAMP as we like to call it. That really kind of breaks this down and says, okay, so for each of these different pieces, user access and productivity, and then security operations, and then the OT space, and then the data center space, what are the sort of low-hanging fruit, the first things to focus on? And we roughly put them in order. Like we said, user access and productivity tends to be the top one. Modernizing SecOps as well, because those are the ones that when you lose that, hey, everything inside the network is trusted assumption, when that starts falling apart, you need to get those two things up as fast as you can. And so, starting with passwordless or MFA, sort of basic best practice there. And then, as much threat intelligence as you can put in through things like Azure AD identity protection are really great first steps. Cloud service driven, fairly easy to implement. They do touch the users and the user experience, but there's a lot of stuff in there to make it as easy as possible and low impact on the users. And then you want to start measuring the devices, right? You want to make sure that those devices are at a good compliant state. And, once you get an EDR on there, like Defender for endpoints, whether or not they're infected at that moment in time. And those are great signals for making sure that you're good enough to actually talk to this resource or asset. And then extending that out to say, okay, now let's go ahead and extend all that goodness to the on-prem apps by publishing them through App Proxy, as well as just natively adopting Azure AD for your new applications. Also for your remote access for VPN authentication as another critical space to make sure that you're getting all that user and device validation goodness before you let people remote access in, even before you publish those apps. And then of course data. You want to be looking for the data, monitoring the user sessions for it, to see if there's any risks or threats or data leakage, and then of course tagging that super sensitive data with Microsoft Information Protection. So that's really kind of the user access productivity one. Modernizing SecOps, this is really where XDR and SIM tools really help get you that broad view as a SIM, a deep tool with XDR that knows an endpoint, that knows Azure Storage, that knows SQL. So that's really kind of the focus there, but there's also some process elements because you want to have not only that unified visibility, but you got to get good at those popular common attacks. So you're blocking and containing those as early as possible during the attacks. And so that's really kind of the focus there. And of course, automation is super critical. Can't say enough about it. The last thing a SOC analyst wants to do is the same repetitive manual task over and over again, because that's going to cause them to get really burned out and either disconnect and disengage from the mission they love or start looking at the job sites. So we really, really want to focus on that and helping them be successful at doing the mission, not repetitive tasks. OT space. Kind of if you've got it, make sure you're monitoring it and dealing with that. The OT section covers that in a lot more detail with Azure Defender for IoT. So I'll leave you to check that one out separately. And then the data center and DevOps. The big lesson here, because there's a lot to do in the data center, but the hygiene of fixing stuff and taking advantage of those software-defined cloud environments. Those cloud data centers, where you basically can find and fix issues so much easier than on-premise because it's all software defined. You can report on that through Azure Security Center, fix things, find the issues, find things that shouldn't be on the internet but are directly on the internet, and reducing legacy risk. And again, the big thing here is as you touch the app, so as you're developing a new app, as you're migrating workloads, that's the perfect time to bring security in. And integrate it into it so that you don't have to go back and manually look at something that isn't otherwise being looked at. And Jan, any last thoughts before we kind of close out on the Zero Trust overview?
No, I think you hit it all really well. I think there's lots of points there that, the one takeaway, and hopefully everybody's tired of hearing it, but unfortunately not enough people are doing it, is MFA, MFA, MFA. This is by far the number one with a bullet that we would recommend that all organizations look to include in their rapid modernization if they're not already doing it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's so cheap for them to get a username password pair that works at an organization off the dark markets and whatnot. I mean, we're talking, dollars, like single-digit dollars to be able to get many passwords and have like a 1% or greater hit rate. So it's very cheap for them to attack. So completely agree. If nothing else on your Zero Trust journey, start MFA today. With that, we'll close out. This has been a Zero Trust overview in the cyber reference architectures. And thank you all very much for watching. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thanks, Mark. Thanks all.